The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and regret. A sterile prison where time seemed to pause, mocking the urgency of life. Eleanor Grayson, 70 years old, lay in the narrow bed. Her frail body a map of a life well-lived, wrinkles tracing laughter, scars whispering battles. And now, a trembling left arm betraying her strength. The stroke had come like a thief, stealing half her body's obedience in a single, cruel moment. She could still hear the doctor's voice, calm but distant, explaining the blockage in her brain, the urgent need for treatment, the slim window of time. But it was another voice that echoed louder in her mind, one that cut deeper than any scalpel, her husband's. "She'll be fine," Richard had said to the nurse, his tone dismissive, almost bored, as if her collapse was a minor inconvenience. He stood by the door, arms crossed, his tailored suit pristine, his face unreadable. 50 years of marriage. And those 3 words were what he offered her as she lay half-paralyzed, fighting to speak. She'll be fine. Not a touch. Not a word of comfort. Just a cold assurance that stripped her of agency, of dignity. Eleanor's heart, already strained, burned with something fiercer than pain betrayal. She wasn't supposed to hear the rest. The nurse had stepped out, and Richard's phone call filled the silence. His voice, low and conspiratorial, drifted to her bed. "It's handled," he said. "The insurance is in place. If she doesn't pull through, we're set. If she does, well, we'll manage." A pause, then a chuckle. "No, she won't suspect a thing. She never has." Eleanor's breath caught, a sharp gasp she prayed he didn't hear. Her mind, foggy from the stroke, clung to those words like a lifeline. Insurance. Set. Suspect. Each syllable was a brick in a wall of truth she'd ignored for decades. Richard, her partner, her confidant, the man who'd promised to love her through sickness and health, was plotting against her. The stroke wasn't just a medical emergency, it was his opportunity. She closed her eyes, feigning sleep, as he ended the call and returned to his vigil by the door. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from a clarity she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't fine. She might never be fine again. But she would not be his victim. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the hospital blinds, casting stripes across Eleanor's bed. Her left side was still numb, her fingers unresponsive, but her mind was a storm of resolve. The doctors were optimistic her speech was returning, and with therapy, she might regain partial mobility. Richard sat beside her now, playing the dutiful husband, his smile practiced but hollow. "You're a fighter, Ellie," he said, patting her hand like one might a child's. She wanted to recoil, but didn't. Not yet. Instead, she watched him. 50 years had taught her his tells, the slight twitch of his lip when he lied, the way his eyes darted when he was nervous. He was nervous now, though he hid it well. She wondered who he'd been speaking to last night. A lover, a business partner, someone complicit in whatever scheme he'd woven around her life insurance. She didn't know the details, but she didn't need to. Not yet. What she needed was time and a plan. The hospital became her battleground. Every physical therapy session, every painful step with the walker, was a rebellion against the fate Richard had assumed for her. She listened to the nurse's chatter, piecing together fragments of medical knowledge. She learned about her condition, about strokes, about recovery rates. She learned about the medications Richard was so eager to manage for her. "I'll handle her pills," he'd told the nurse, his voice firm. "She gets confused easily." Confused. That word stung, but Eleanor turned it into fuel. She began to ask questions, innocent at first, about her treatment, her prognosis. She watched Richard's reactions. noting how he deflected, how he changed the subject when she pressed too hard. She started hiding her progress, exaggerating her weakness in front of him. When he visited, she slurred her words slightly, let her hand tremble more than it needed to. Let him think she was frail, helpless. Let him underestimate her. By the time she was discharged 2 weeks later, Eleanor had a map in her mind not of her body's recovery, but of Richard's betrayal. She didn't know the full scope of his plan, but she knew enough. He was counting on her fragility, her trust. He was wrong. At home, their sprawling colonial house felt like a stage for a play she no longer believed in. Richard fussed over her, arranging pillows, fetching water, his every gesture a performance. She played her part, too grateful, dependent, the perfect invalid. But behind her tired smile, her mind was sharp, cataloging every detail. The locked drawer in his study, the late-night phone calls he took in the garage, the new lawyer he mentioned in passing, the one handling some updates to their estate. Eleanor began her work in secret. She'd always been resourceful, a skill honed in her youth as a schoolteacher, raising 3 children on a tight budget while Richard climbed the corporate ladder. Now, she used that resourcefulness to dig. She started with the mail, sifting through bills and letters when Richard was at his golf club. A statement from their insurance company caught her eye, a policy she didn't recognize, with a payout far larger than anything they'd discussed. Her name was on it, but the beneficiary was a trust she'd never heard of. She didn't confront him. Not yet. Confrontation would tip her hand, and she wasn't ready. Instead, she began to build her own network. She reconnected with old friends, claiming loneliness, but really seeking allies. Margaret, her former colleague, was a retired paralegal with a sharp mind and a knack for research. Tom, their neighbor, was a retired accountant who loved a puzzle. Eleanor fed them small tasks: check a public record, look up a company name without revealing the full picture. She was careful, deliberate, a spider spinning a web. One night, as Richard slept, Eleanor sat at her old typewriter, a relic from her teaching days. Her fingers, still clumsy from the stroke, pecked at the keys. She wrote a letter to herself, a reminder of who she was, Eleanor Grayson. Survivor. You are not his pawn. You will not break. She hid it in a book of poetry, a place Richard would never look. Her plan was forming, but it was incomplete. She needed proof, something undeniable that would expose Richard's betrayal. And she needed to protect herself, because if he sensed her suspicion, he might act first. The stroke had been a warning, a crack in the facade of their marriage. She wouldn't wait for the next one. Eleanor's days became a delicate dance of deception. She moved through the house with a cane, leaning heavily when Richard was around, her steps slow and deliberate. But when he left for his weekly business meetings, a vague excuse, she no longer believed she shed the pretense. Her physical therapy exercises, done in secret, were strengthening her body. But it was her mind that carried the heavier load. She was piecing together a puzzle with stakes higher than she'd ever imagined. The insurance policy was her first real clue. She'd managed to sneak a photo of the document with her old flip phone, a device Richard never bothered to check. The trust listed as the beneficiary was called Bright Future Holdings, a name that sounded optimistic but reeked of deceit. With Margaret's help, Eleanor traced it to a shell company registered in Delaware, a state notorious for its secrecy. Margaret, with her paralegal instincts, dug deeper, uncovering a trail of paperwork that led to a lawyer named Victor Crane. The name was unfamiliar, but Eleanor memorized it. Another piece in her growing arsenal. She began to notice other inconsistencies. Richard's behavior had shifted in subtle ways: more late nights, more locked doors, more excuses. He'd always been private, But now his secrecy felt deliberate, weaponized. One evening, as he showered, Eleanor slipped into his study. The locked drawer in his desk had always intrigued her, but she'd never had reason to question it until now. With a hairpin and a YouTube tutorial she'd watched on her phone, she fumbled with the lock until it clicked open. Her heart raced as she sifted through the contents: financial statements, a second phone, and a folder labeled estate plan. The folder was a goldmine. It contained a revised will, dated just weeks before her stroke. Richard had rewritten everything, funneling their assets, her assets, into Bright Future Holdings upon her death. The will was notarized by Victor Crane. Eleanor's hands shook as she photographed each page, her left hand still weak but steady enough for this. She locked the drawer and retreated to her bedroom, her mind reeling. He wasn't just planning for her death, was banking on it. Eleanor's next move was riskier. She needed to know who Richard was working with. The second phone in the drawer was a burner, cheap and untraceable, but it was password protected. She couldn't crack it without help, and she wasn't ready to involve anyone else so deeply. Instead, she turned to Tom, the accountant neighbor, asking him to look into Bright Future Holdings financials. Just curious about some investments, she lied, her voice light. Tom, eager for a challenge, didn't question her. While Tom worked, Eleanor focused on her recovery. She pushed herself harder in therapy, regaining strength in her left leg, though she kept her progress hidden from Richard. She started walking the neighborhood when he was gone, using the time to clear her head and plan. One afternoon, she stopped by the local library, where she used a public computer to search for Victor Crane. The results were sparse but telling: a slick website for a law firm, a few articles about high-profile estate cases, and a single photo of a man in his 50s, sharp-eyed and smug. She printed the photo and tucked it into her purse. Her evenings were spent maintaining the facade. Richard was home more often now, perhaps sensing her growing independence. He hovered, offering tea, adjusting her blankets, his concern a mask for control. Eleanor played along, but every touch felt like a violation. She began to notice his impatience, the way his jaw tightened when she asked for help with small tasks. He wanted her weak, dependent, but she was anything but. One night, as they sat in the living room, Richard's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then excused himself to the garage. Eleanor waited, counting the seconds, then crept to the window. She couldn't hear his words, but his tone was sharp, urgent. When he returned, he was distracted, his smile forced. "Work stuff," he muttered. She nodded, her face blank, but her mind was racing. Whoever was on the other end of that call was part of his plan, and she would find them. Tom came through a week later. Over coffee in his cluttered kitchen, he handed her a folder. "Bright Future Holdings is a front," he said, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of discovery. "It's tied to a series of offshore accounts, but the trail gets murky. Whoever set this up knows how to hide money." He hesitated, then added, "Eleanor, are you in some kind of trouble?" She smiled, deflecting. "Just tying up loose ends. Tom, you know how it is at our age." He didn't push, but his concern lingered in her mind. She couldn't afford to trust anyone completely. Not yet. The folder confirmed her suspicions. Richard was funneling money somewhere, likely to someone waiting for her to die. The thought made her stomach churn, but it also steeled her resolve. That night, Eleanor sat at her typewriter again. She wrote another letter to herself, this one longer, detailing everything she'd uncovered. It was her insurance policy, a record of her suspicions in case something happened to her. She hid it in a different book, a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice, its pages yellowed but comforting. Writing grounded her, reminded her of the woman she'd been before Richard's betrayal consumed her thoughts. She knew she was running out of time. Richard's impatience was growing, and she sensed he was planning his next move. She needed to act first. But she needed more proof that would hold up. Not just to her, but to the world. She needed to catch him in the act. To expose him before he could harm her again. The stroke had nearly taken her life. But it had also given her clarity. She was no longer the trusting wife. The passive partner. She was Eleanor Grayson. And she would fight. Eleanor's world had narrowed to a single purpose, uncovering Richard's plan before it consumed her. The house, once a home, now felt like a chessboard. Every move calculated. Every word a potential trap. She continued her charade of frailty. But her mind was ablaze, sharpened by betrayal. She began to test Richard, dropping subtle hints to gauge his reactions. "I've been thinking about updating our will," she said one morning over breakfast. Her voice weak but deliberate. His coffee cup paused midair, his eyes flickering with something she couldn't quite name: fear. Perhaps. Or calculation. "Good idea," he said. Too quickly. "I'll call Victor. He's handling everything." Victor Crane again. The name was a thread she needed to pull. But carefully. She nodded, letting the conversation drop. But her pulse quickened. Richard was nervous. And that was her advantage. She needed access to his burner phone. It was the key to his secrets. But he kept it close, either in his pocket or locked in his study. Eleanor waited for an opportunity. And it came one afternoon when Richard left for a quick errand. He'd forgotten his jacket. A rare slip. And the burner phone was inside. Her hands trembled as she powered it on, praying it wasn't locked. The screen lit up no password. Just a basic interface. She scrolled through the call log, a single number, dialed repeatedly over the past month. She memorized it, then turned the phone off and returned it to the jacket just as Richard's car pulled into the driveway. That night, she called Margaret from a payphone at the library, a precaution to avoid Richard's scrutiny. "Can you trace a number?" she asked, keeping her voice low. Margaret, sensing the urgency, didn't ask questions. By the next day, she had a name: Laura Hensley, a woman in her 40s, listed as a financial consultant with ties to Victor Crane's law firm. Eleanor's heart sank. A lover, perhaps, or a partner in Richard's scheme. Either way, Laura was a piece of the puzzle. Eleanor's next step was bold. She contacted Laura under the guise of a potential client, using a burner phone she'd bought with cash. "I'm interested in estate planning," she said, her voice steady despite the lie. Laura's tone was professional but warm, and she agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown. Eleanor prepared meticulously, choosing a loose scarf and glasses to obscure her face. She told Richard she was visiting a friend, and he didn't question her sign of his arrogance. She thought. The meeting was a revelation. Laura was polished, confident. Her smile practiced, but not insincere. She spoke of trusts and investments with ease. But Eleanor noticed her hesitation when asked about Bright Future Holdings. "That's a specialized entity," Laura said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Not something we typically discuss with new clients." Eleanor pressed, feigning confusion, and Laura deflected, steering the conversation to safer topics. But Eleanor had seen enough. Laura was involved, and she was cautious. On the way home, Eleanor stopped at the library again, using the public computer to dig into Laura Hensley. Social media revealed little, but a business registry listed her as a co-owner of a consulting firm with Victor Crane. The pieces were falling into place. Richard, Laura, and Victor were linked. Their plans centered on the insurance money and the trust. But Eleanor needed more than connection. She needed evidence of intent. She began to monitor Richard's movements more closely. She noticed he left the house every Tuesday evening, always returning after midnight. One night, she followed him, borrowing Tom's car to avoid recognition. Her heart pounded as she trailed his sleek black sedan to a nondescript office building on the edge of town. Through the window, she saw him meet Laura and Victor, their heads bent over documents. She couldn't hear their words, but their body language tense. Conspiratorial told her enough. She snapped photos with her phone, her hands shaking but her resolve firm. Back home, Eleanor's secret letters grew longer. She wrote every detail, every suspicion, every piece of evidence. The act of writing was her rebellion, a way to reclaim her voice when her body had betrayed her. She hid the letters in different books, scattering them like breadcrumbs for someone to find if she didn't survive this. But survival wasn't enough. She wanted justice. Her physical therapy was paying off. She could walk without the cane now, though she kept it for show. Her left hand was stronger, enough to hold a pen steadily, to type without faltering. But the emotional toll was heavier. Every smile from Richard, every "How are you feeling, Ellie?" was a reminder of his duplicity. She began to dream of confronting him, of seeing his face when he realized she knew. But dreams weren't enough. She needed a plan that would ruin him, not just expose him. Margaret called with a breakthrough. She'd found a public record linking Bright Future Holdings to a series of questionable transactions, including a payment to a medical supply company. "It's odd," Margaret said. "Why would a trust need medical equipment?" Eleanor's blood ran cold. She thought of Richard's insistence on managing her medications, his eagerness to help with her recovery. Was he tampering with her pills? The thought was a knife in her gut, but it also clarified her next move. She needed to protect herself and strike back. She began researching her medications, cross-referencing them with the hospital's records. She noticed discrepancies, pills that didn't match the prescribed dosage, a bottle labeled incorrectly. She didn't confront Richard, but she stopped taking the pills he gave her, flushing them and replacing them with placebos she'd bought online. It was a risk, but so was trusting him. Eleanor was no longer just surviving. She was fighting, and she was winning. Eleanor's world was a tightrope, and every step was a gamble. She'd stopped taking Richard's pills, but the fear lingered. What else was he capable of? Her body was regaining strength, her left side less rebellious with each passing day, but her mind bore the weight of her discoveries. Richard, Laura, Victor, their names were a mantra, a reminder of the stakes. She was close to unraveling their plan, but closeness wasn't enough. She needed something airtight, something that would destroy Richard's carefully constructed lie. She began to set traps. She left her phone unlocked on the kitchen counter, a fake email draft open, hinting at her suspicions about the insurance policy. Richard took the bait, his face tightening as he glanced at the screen when he thought she wasn't looking. She planted questions, casual but pointed, about his late-night meetings, watching his lies pile up like kindling. "Just catching up with old colleagues," he'd say, but his eyes betrayed him, darting to the side, his fingers tapping nervously. Her biggest risk was the burner phone. She'd memorized the number Laura called from, and one night, when Richard was asleep, she used her own burner to send a text, "Meeting off. Need to talk. Urgent." She didn't expect a reply, but she got one within minutes. "What's wrong? Call me." It was Laura. Eleanor's heart race edged stirred the hornet's nest. She didn't respond, but the reply confirmed Laura's role. They were scared, and scared people made mistakes. Tom's research deepened the web. He'd traced the medical supply company to a warehouse owned by a subsidiary of Bright Future Holdings. "They're buying equipment that doesn't match your prescriptions," he said, his voice low over the phone. "Syringes. For drip stuff for long-term care, not stroke recovery." Eleanor's stomach twisted. Long-term care. Were they planning to keep her alive but incapacitated? A living cash cow for their scheme. The thought was monstrous, but it fit Richard's cold pragmatism. She needed to catch them in the act. She contacted a private investigator, a gruff man named Daniel whom Margaret recommended. Discreet and thorough, Margaret had said, and Eleanor trusted her judgment. She met Daniel in a diner, her scarf and glasses her only disguise. She handed him the photos, the documents, the phone number. "I need proof," she said. "Something that ties them together, Richard. Laura, Victor, and the money." Daniel nodded, his face unreadable. "This is heavy. Mrs. Grayson, you sure you want to go down this road?" She met his gaze, her voice steady. "I'm already on it." He agreed to tail Richard and Laura, to dig into Victor's firm. It would take time, he warned. And money. Eleanor had both. Thanks to a savings account Richard didn't know about, a relic from her teaching days. Her just-in-case fund. She'd never imagined the case would be this. At home, Eleanor's performance grew more convincing. She leaned into her supposed frailty, asking Richard for help with tasks she could manage alone. She watched his frustration grow, his mask slipping in small ways, a sigh when she spilled her water, a sharp tone when she asked about his day. He was unraveling, and she was pushing him toward it. But she was careful. She installed a cheap security camera in the living room, disguised as a clock, to record his movements when she wasn't around. She checked it daily, catching glimpses of him rifling through her things, searching for something, her phone, perhaps, or her letters. One evening, she overheard another call. Richard was in the garage, his voice low but audible through the cracked window. "She's asking too many questions," he said. "We need to move faster." A pause. Then, "No, not yet. She's still useful." Useful. The word was a slap, but it fueled her. She wasn't his pawn, she was his reckoning. Daniel's first report came a week later. He'd followed Laura to a meeting with Victor at a hotel bar, where they'd exchanged a flash drive. He couldn't get close enough to hear their conversation, but he'd managed to photograph the exchange. The flash drive was a new piece of the puzzle, and Eleanor's mind raced with possibilities. Financial records, a contract, instructions for her care. She asked Daniel to keep digging, to follow the flash drive's trail. Eleanor's letters became her sanctuary. She wrote late at night, her typewriter's clack a quiet rebellion. She detailed every move, every discovery, her words a lifeline to her own strength. She began to plan her endgame, not just exposure, but destruction. Richard had built his life on control, on manipulating those around him. She would take that control away, piece by piece. She started small, sowing discord. She left an anonymous tip with Victor's law firm, claiming a client had concerns about Bright Future Holdings' legitimacy. She mailed a vague letter to Laura's office, hinting at a whistleblower. She wanted them paranoid, looking over their shoulders, questioning each other. If they turned on one another, they'd make mistakes. And mistakes were what she needed. Her body was her ally now. She could walk unaided, her left hand steady enough to pour her own tea. She stopped hiding her progress entirely, letting Richard catch glimpses of her strength, a firm grip on a glass, a brisk step across the room. His confusion was palpable, his eyes narrowing as he reassessed her. She wanted him to doubt, to wonder if he'd underestimated her. She was no longer the woman he'd dismissed in the hospital, and she would make sure he knew it. The clock was ticking. Daniel was close to something Bide hinted at, a breakthrough, a document that could tie everything together. Eleanor felt the weight of her mission, the risk of every step. But she also felt alive, more alive than she had in years. The stroke had nearly broken her, but it had also set her free. She was ready to fight, and she would not stop until Richard's world was in ruins. The air in the house grew thicker, charged with unspoken tension. Eleanor could feel Richard's suspicion, his eyes lingering on her when he thought she wasn't looking. She'd pushed him too far. Perhaps, with her subtle displays of strength, her probing questions. But there was no turning back. She was a hunter now, and Richard was her prey. Every move she made was calculated, every word a weapon. She knew the end was near, either hers or his. Daniel's breakthrough came on a rainy afternoon. He met her at the diner, his face grim as he slid a manila envelope across the table. "This is what you wanted," he said, his voice low. "But it's ugly." Inside were bank records, emails, and a scanned contract, all linking Richard, Laura, and Victor to Bright Future Holdings. The contract was the most damning, a plan to declare Eleanor incapacitated, placing her in a private care facility funded by the trust. The insurance payout would follow her death, funneled through the trust to offshore accounts. Richard's signature was on every page, bold and unapologetic. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read. System read, her breath catching at the cold reality of Richard's betrayal laid bare on paper. The contract wasn't just a plan, it was a blueprint for her erasure. Declaring her incapacitated would strip her of control, leaving her a prisoner in her own life. Her wealth siphoned off while she lingered in a facility chosen not for care, but for convenience. The emails, intercepted from the flash drive Daniel had tracked, revealed Richard's impatience, his frustration with her recovery. "She's stronger than we thought," he'd written to Laura. "We need to accelerate the timeline." Victor's replies were clinical, outlining legal steps to expedite the process. It was a betrayal so meticulous, so calculated. It stole her breath. But Eleanor didn't break. She folded the papers, her resolve hardening. This was the proof she needed, not just to confirm her suspicions, but to dismantle Richard's world. She thanked Daniel, her voice steady despite the storm in her chest, and returned home with the envelope hidden in her purse. The weight of it felt like a weapon, one she would wield carefully. She moved quickly now, her plan taking shape. She contacted Margaret, who connected her with a lawyer of her own, a woman named Sarah who specialized in elder law. Sarah's office was small but warm, her demeanor sharp yet compassionate. Eleanor laid out everything: the stroke, Richard's words in the hospital, the insurance policy, the trust, the contract. Sarah listened, her face tightening with each revelation. "This is fraud," she said, her voice firm. "An attempted coercion. We can build a case, but we need to protect you first." Protection meant legal and physical steps. Sarah drafted an emergency revision to Eleanor's will, redirecting her assets to a new trust one Richard couldn't touch. She also filed for a restraining order, citing the threat of coercion and potential harm based on the contract. Eleanor hesitated at this. She wasn't ready to tip her hand fully, but Sarah insisted. "He's dangerous," she said. "You've seen what he's capable of." Eleanor agreed, but only if the order was held until she gave the word. She wanted Richard to feel safe, complacent, until she was ready to strike. Physically, she took precautions. She installed a deadbolt on her bedroom door, a silent rebellion against Richard's control. She kept her burner phone hidden, checking it daily for updates from Daniel. She continued her therapy in secret, her body now strong enough to move with confidence, though she maintained the facade of frailty at home. Richard's frustration was palpable. He snapped at small things, his temper fraying. She fed that frustration, asking pointed questions about their finances, mentioning Victor's name casually, watching his composure crack. One night, she overheard another call. Richard was in the garage, his voice a low growl. She's digging, he said. I found a note in her book, something about the trust. We need to move now. Eleanor's heart raced. The note was one of her letters, deliberately left where he might find it. She'd wanted to rattle him, and it was working, but it also meant her time was running out. Richard was desperate, and desperate men were unpredictable. She met with Sarah again, finalizing her plan. The new will was notarized, her assets secured. Sarah also suggested a public confrontation, a way to expose Richard without giving him room to maneuver. Eleanor liked the idea. She wanted him to face the consequences in front of those he'd charmed, the friends and colleagues who saw him as the perfect husband. She began to plan an event, a celebration of her recovery, inviting their social circle to the house. It would be the stage for her final move. She also reached out to Laura, using her burner phone to schedule another meeting. This time, she didn't disguise herself. She wanted Laura to know who she was, to see the woman she'd underestimated. At the coffee shop, Laura's face paled when Eleanor introduced herself. I know about Bright Future, Eleanor said, her voice calm but razor sharp. And I know what you and Richard planned. Laura stammered, denying involvement, but her eyes betrayed her guilt. Eleanor didn't push, she didn't need to. The meeting was enough to plant fear, to make Laura doubt Richard's control. Eleanor's letters grew more urgent, each one a testament to her strength. She wrote of her fear, her anger, her determination to reclaim her life. She hid them in New Placiza jewelry box, a sewing kit, knowing Richard was searching. She wanted him to find fragments, to feel the walls closing in. Her security camera caught him pacing at night, checking her room, his paranoia evident. She was winning, but the victory was bittersweet. This was the man she'd loved, the father of her children, now reduced to a stranger plotting her demise. Daniel's final report confirmed the last piece, a recorded conversation between Richard and Victor, discussing the facility and the payout. It was enough to seal their fate. Eleanor copied the evidence onto a USB drive, storing it with her lawyer. She was ready, but the weight of it all, 50 years of marriage, unraveling and betrayal, pressed against her. She allowed herself one night to grieve, tears falling as she sat at her typewriter. She wrote not to herself this time, but to Richard, a letter she'd never send. You thought I was weak, but I am stronger than you'll ever know. The celebration was set for the following week. Eleanor planned every detail, her heart steady despite the storm. She would expose Richard, Laura, and Victor, not just for herself, but for the woman she'd been, the one who'd trusted, loved, and believed in forever. She would make sure he never got fine again. The day of the celebration arrived, a crisp autumn evening that masked the storm brewing in Eleanor's heart. The house was transformed, adorned with flowers and soft lighting, a facade of warmth for the guests' friends, neighbors, colleagues who filled the rooms with laughter and clinking glasses. Eleanor wore a simple but elegant dress, her silver hair swept up, her cane a prop rather than a necessity. She moved through the crowd with practiced frailty, smiling, thanking them for their support during her recovery. Richard played his part, too, the charming host, his arm around her as if they were the picture of devotion. But Eleanor saw the strain in his eyes, the way he scanned the room, searching for threats. She'd planned this night meticulously. Sarah was there, discreetly positioned near the back, ready to step in if needed. Daniel was outside, his car parked a block away, his evidence ready to be presented. Margaret and Tom were among the guests, their faces warm but their eyes sharp, aware of the stakes. Eleanor had shared just enough with them, trusting their loyalty but protecting them from the full weight of her plan. The moment came after dinner, when the guests gathered in the living room for toasts. Eleanor stood, her voice steady, her cane set aside. I want to thank you all, she began, her words warm but deliberate. And I want to thank Richard, my husband, who said in the hospital, she'll be fine. The room chuckled, but Richard's smile faltered. She continued, her voice gaining strength. But I wasn't fine. I was betrayed. The room fell silent. Eleanor signaled to Sarah, who stepped forward with a projector. Daniel entered, handing her the USB drive. The screen lit up with the contract, the bank records, the emails, Richard's signature stark against the white background. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Eleanor narrated, her voice clear and unyielding. My husband planned to declare me incapacitated, to profit from my death. He worked with Laura Hensley and Victor Crane to steal my life, my dignity. Richard's face drained of color. He stammered, this is nonsense. Ellie, you're confused. But the evidence was undeniable. Guests whispered, their shock palpable. Laura, who'd been invited under a false pretense, stood frozen in the corner. Victor wasn't there, but his name echoed in the room. Eleanor played the recorded conversation, Richard's voice admitting his plan. The room was a sea of stunned faces, friends turning away from the man they'd admired. Sarah stepped forward, announcing the restraining order and the revised will. Mrs. Grayson is protected, she said, and we're pursuing charges for fraud and coercion. Richard lunged toward Eleanor, but Tom and another guest restrained him. The police, alerted by Daniel, arrived minutes later. Richard was escorted out, his protest drowned by the weight of his own words. The aftermath was quiet but profound. Laura and Victor faced investigations, their reputations unraveling as the evidence spread. Eleanor's children, now grown, rallied around her, their shock tempered by her strength. The house, once a prison, became hers again. She sold it, moving to a small cottage where she could breathe freely. Her letters, retrieved from their hiding places, were bound into a journal, a testament to her survival. She continued her therapy, her body stronger than ever, a mirror of her spirit. She volunteered at a stroke recovery center, sharing her story, inspiring others. The pain of Richard's betrayal lingered, but it no longer defined her. She was Eleanor Grayson, survivor, warrior, a woman who'd turned betrayal into triumph. Her final letter, written in the cottage's garden, was a promise to herself, you are enough. You always were. She tucked it into a new book, a collection of poems about resilience, and smiled. Richard had thought her weak, but she'd ensured he'd never know peace again. His world was in ruins, and hers was just beginning.